In this video, I will present before you a comprehensive list of all the winners in the men's singles category in the Open era of Grand Slam tennis, starting with the French Open in 1968, which was won by Australian legend Ken Rosewall. 1968 Wimbledon was won by Rod Laver. 1968 US Open was won by Arthur Ashe. In 1969, Rod Laver won all four majors, thereby becoming the first and so far the only tennis player in men's singles to win what is known as the Grand Slam. In 1970, Australian Open was won by Arthur Ashe. In 1970, French Open was won by Jan Cordes. John Newcombe won Wimbledon in 1970. Ken Rosewall won US Open in 1970. Ken Rosewall also won the Australian Open in 1971. Jan Cordes defended his French Open title in 1971, and John Newcombe also defended his Wimbledon title in 1971. Stan Smith won the US Open in 1971. Ken Rosewall was able to defend his Australian Open title in 1972. Andres Gimeno won the French Open in 1972. Stan Smith won Wimbledon in 1972, and Ilie Nastase won the US Open in 1972. John Newcombe won the Australian Open in 1973. Ilie Nastase won the French Open in 1973. Jan Cordes won Wimbledon in 1973, and John Newcombe won the US Open in 1973. Jimmy Connors won the Australian Open in 1974. Bjorn Borg won his first French Open in 1974. Jimmy Connors won his first Wimbledon in 1974, and Jimmy Connors also won the US Open in 1974. 1975 Australian Open was won by John Newcombe. 1975 French Open was won by Bjorn Borg. 1975 Wimbledon title was won by Arthur Ashe, and 1975 US Open was won by Manuel Orantes. 1976 marked the most recent instance when an Australian men's singles tennis player won the Australian Open. The winner was Mark Edmondson. 1976 French Open was won by Adriano Panatta. 1976 Wimbledon was won by Swedish legend Bjorn Borg. 1976 US Open was won by American legend Jimmy Connors. 1977 had two Australian Opens, one in January and one in December. The one in January was won by Roscoe Tanner. French Open in 1977 was won by Guillermo Villa. Wimbledon in 1977 was won by Bjorn Borg. US Open in 1977 was won by Guillermo Villa. And the December edition of the 1977 Australian Open was won by American tennis player Vitas Gerulaitis. 1978 Australian Open was won by Guillermo Villa. This was played in December. 1978 French Open was won by Bjorn Borg. 1978 Wimbledon was won by Bjorn Borg, and 1978 US Open was won by Jimmy Connors. 1979 French Open was won by Bjorn Borg. 1979 Wimbledon was won by Bjorn Borg, and US Open in 1979 was won by American legend John McEnroe. Australian Open in 1979 was won by Guillermo Villa. Remember, in these years, Australian Open was played in December and not in January as it is in today's day and age. In 1980, French Open was once again won by Bjorn Borg. Wimbledon in 1980 was once again won by Bjorn Borg in one of the most famous matches ever played between Bjorn Borg and John McEnroe. And 1980 US Open was won by American John McEnroe. 1980 Australian Open was won by Brian Teacher. 1981 French Open was won by Bjorn Borg. 1981 Wimbledon final was won by John McEnroe, who defeated Bjorn Borg in the final. 1981 US Open final was won by John McEnroe, and 1981 Australian Open was won by Johan Kriek. In 1982 French Open was won by Mats Wilander. In 1982 Wimbledon was won by Jimmy Connors. In 1982 US Open was won by Jimmy Connors, and in 1982 Australian Open was once again won by Johan Kriek, who was able to defend his victory in the Australian Open. In 1983 French Open was won by Yannick Noah. In 1983 John McEnroe won Wimbledon, and Jimmy Connors won the US Open in 1983. Mats Wilander won the Australian Open in 1983. Ivan Lendl won the French Open in 1984, coming from 2 sets down to defeat John McEnroe in the final. John McEnroe won Wimbledon in 1984. John McEnroe also won the US Open in 1984. Mats Wilander won the Australian Open once again in 1984. In 1985, Mats Wilander won the French Open, and Boris Becker won Wimbledon, Ivan Lendl won the US Open, and Stefan Edberg won the Australian Open. This was the most recent instance of the Australian Open being played in December instead of January. In 1986, Australian Open was not played. French Open was played and was won by Ivan Lendl. Boris Becker won Wimbledon for the second time in 1986. Ivan Lendl was able to defend his US Open title in 1986. Stefan Edberg won the Australian Open in 1987 when it had been restored to its January date. Ivan Lendl won French Open in 1987. Pat Cash won Wimbledon in 1987, and Ivan Lendl won the US Open for the third consecutive time in 1987. Mats Wilander won the Australian Open in 1988. Mats Wilander also won the French Open in 1988. Stefan Edberg won Wimbledon in 1988, and Mats Wilander won the US Open in 1988. In 1989, Ivan Lendl won the Australian Open. Michael Chang in 1989 won the French Open. Boris Becker won Wimbledon in 1989, and Boris Becker also won the US Open in 1989. In 1990, Australian Open was won by Ivan Lendl. In 1990, French Open was won by Andres Gomez. In 1990, Wimbledon was won by Stefan Edberg, and in 1990, the US Open was won by Pete Sampras. Boris Becker won the Australian Open in 1991. Jim Courier won the French Open in 1991. Michael Stich won Wimbledon in 1991, and Stefan Edberg won the US Open in 1991. Jim Courier won the Australian Open in 1992. Jim Courier also won the French Open in 1992. Andre Agassi won Wimbledon in 1992. Remember, Andre Agassi won Wimbledon before Pete Sampras had secured his first victory at Wimbledon. Stefan Edberg won the US Open in 1992. In 1993, Jim Courier was able to defend his Australian Open title. Sergi Bruguera won the French Open in 1993. Pete Sampras won his first Wimbledon title in 1993. Pete Sampras won his second US Open title in 1993. Pete Sampras won his third consecutive major by winning the Australian Open in 1994. Sergi Bruguera was able to defend his French Open title in 1994. Pete Sampras was able to defend his Wimbledon title in 1994. And Andre Agassi won the US Open in 1994. Andre Agassi also won the Australian Open in 1995. Thomas Muster won the French Open in 1995. Pete Sampras won Wimbledon in 1995 for the third consecutive time. Pete Sampras also won the US Open in 1995. Boris Becker won the Australian Open in 1996. Yevgeny Kafelnikov won the French Open in 1996. Richard Krajicek won Wimbledon in 1996, and Pete Sampras won the US Open in 1996. Pete Sampras won the Australian Open in 1997. Gustavo Kuerten from Brazil won the French Open in 1997. Pete Sampras won his fourth Wimbledon title in 1997. Patrick Rafter from Australia won the US Open in 1997. In 1998, Petr Korda won the Australian Open. Carlos Moya in 1998 won the French Open. Pete Sampras in 1998 won Wimbledon, and Patrick Rafter was able to defend his US Open title in 1998. Yevgeny Kafelnikov won the Australian Open in 1999. Andre Agassi won his first French Open title in 1999. Pete Sampras won Wimbledon in 1999, and Andre Agassi won the US Open in 1999. Andre Agassi also won the Australian Open in 2000. Gustavo Kuerten won his second French Open title in 2000. Pete Sampras won Wimbledon for the seventh time in 2000. Marat Safin won the US Open in 2000. Andre Agassi was able to defend his Australian Open title in 2001. Gustavo Kuerten was able to defend his French Open title in 2001. Goran Ivanisevic won his first Wimbledon title in 2001, and Lleyton Hewitt won his first major by winning the US Open in 2001. 2002 Australian Open was won by Thomas Johansson. 2002 French Open was won by Albert Costa. 2002 Wimbledon was won by Lleyton Hewitt, and 2002 US Open was won by Pete Sampras. 2003 Australian Open was won by Andre Agassi. 2003 French Open was won by Juan Carlos Ferrero. 2003 Wimbledon was won by Roger Federer. 2003 US Open was won by Andy Roddick of Served with Andy Roddick fame. 2004 Australian Open was won by Roger Federer. 2004 French Open was won by Gaston Gaudio. 2004 Wimbledon was won by Roger Federer. 2004 US Open was won by Roger Federer. 2005 Australian Open was won by Marat Safin. 2005 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2005 Wimbledon was won by Roger Federer. 2005 US Open was won by Roger Federer. 2006 Australian Open was won by Roger Federer. 2006 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2006 Wimbledon was won by Roger Federer. 2006 US Open was won by Roger Federer. 2007 Australian Open was won by Roger Federer. 2007 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2007 Wimbledon was won by Roger Federer. 2007 US Open was won by Roger Federer. 2008 Australian Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2008 French Open was won in astounding fashion, sheer dominance by Rafael Nadal. 2008 Wimbledon final, one of the greatest matches ever played, was won by Rafael Nadal. 2008 US Open was won by Roger Federer. 2009 Australian Open final was won by Rafael Nadal. 2009 French Open was won by Roger Federer. 2009 Wimbledon was won by Roger Federer. 2009 US Open was won by Juan Martín del Potro. 2010 Australian Open was won by Roger Federer. 2010 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2010 Wimbledon was won by Rafael Nadal. 2010 US Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2011 Australian Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2011 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2011 Wimbledon was won by Novak Djokovic. 2011 US Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2012 Australian Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2012 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2012 Wimbledon was won by Roger Federer. 2012 US Open was won by Andy Murray. 2013 Australian Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2013 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2013 Wimbledon was won by Andy Murray. 2013 US Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2014 Australian Open was won by Stan Wawrinka. 2014 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2014 Wimbledon was won by Novak Djokovic. 2014 US Open was won by Marin Cilic. 2015 Australian Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2015 French Open was won by Stan Wawrinka. 2015 Wimbledon was won by Novak Djokovic. 2015 US Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2016 Australian Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2016 French Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2016 Wimbledon was won by Andy Murray. 2016 US Open was won by Stan Wawrinka. 2017 Australian Open was won by Roger Federer. 2017 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2017 Wimbledon was won by Roger Federer. 2017 US Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2018 Australian Open was won by Roger Federer. 2018 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2018 Wimbledon was won by Novak Djokovic. 2018 US Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2019 Australian Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2019 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2019 Wimbledon was won by Novak Djokovic. 2019 US Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2020 Australian Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2020 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2020 Wimbledon was not held. 2020 US Open was won by Dominic Thiem. 2021 Australian Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2021 French Open was also won by Novak Djokovic. 2021 Wimbledon was also won by Novak Djokovic, and 2021 US Open was not won by Novak Djokovic but won by Daniil Medvedev. 2022 Australian Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2022 French Open was won by Rafael Nadal. 2022 Wimbledon was won by Novak Djokovic, and 2022 US Open was won by Carlos Alcaraz. 2023 Australian Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2023 French Open was won by Novak Djokovic. 2023 Wimbledon was won by Carlos Alcaraz, and 2023 US Open was won by Novak Djokovic. In 2024 Australian Open was won by Yannick Sinner. In 2024 French Open was won by Carlos Alcaraz. In 2024 Wimbledon was won by Carlos Alcaraz. In 2024 US Open was won by Yannick Sinner, and in 2025 Australian Open was won by Yannick Sinner. My prediction is 2025 French Open will be won by Carlos Alcaraz. Let me know what your prediction is in the comment section.